Hello, hello, and welcome to the Smoko podcast. My name is Alexis Armstrong, your host. Nice to meet you. The Smoko podcast is the place to celebrate and highlight women, trans women, and non binary folk working within STEM and trade occupations. So please tune in, take a break, and join us. Today, we are extremely lucky to be joined by the lovely Katherine Andrews, who is a botanist. She studies plant biology. And her background and her experience has been working within the cannabis sector. So she's a cannabis professional. Her background was in product development. She also has experience working within cultivation standards and practices. And so we're going to talk about botany, about the role of a botanist in the cannabis sector. We're going to talk a lot about product development and what goes into it from a science perspective. And we're also just going to talk about the cannabis sector at large, a couple of misconceptions of it, and her experience working within sciences. So Kat, thank you so much for coming on the show. It is so nice to meet you. Thank you for coming on Smoko.
Thank you for having me.
No, this is awesome. I'm like so excited to have this conversation because I just think it's so interesting and there's so many aspects that I'm fascinated by. So I can't wait to get into it. You completed your bachelor's of science in biology and environmental science, and then your master's in plant biology and conservation. I was wondering if we could kind of start there and start at your initial interest of botany. Like, what was it about plants that just clicked that you were like, yep, this is what I want to study? And then how did you discover that that was the field that you were interested in?
I've always loved plants and pretty much
Mm.
all things nature and outdoors. Since I was a little kid and I could remember, I grew up in Florida, spent most of my time outside. When I was inside, let's say watching TV, I had that VHS tape set
Mhm.
of like David Attenborough, Planet Earth back in the day. He was basically my equivalent to Morgan Freeman as a child in terms of
I love
narration. Yeah, no,
it.
he's absolutely great. Still watch his stuff. But so always loved it, was really kind of involved in it from a young age. When I went to college though, I kind of lost sight of it actually. So I was
Okay.
studying, yeah, like neuroscience and botany. I thought I was going to go to medical school, the whole pre-med track that I feel like so many college students think they're going to do. And yeah, I had these two internships. Both were at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. The first one was with Dr. Fabio Ray, where we were studying the
Mm.
inept and adept immune system. And then I
Cool.
worked in Michelle Hastings' labs, and she did neurodegenerative disease and cognitive behavioral mouse models. And those experiences were super great. I got a lot of, great hands on experience in the lab, learned a lot, but I really struggled with the animal testing in it.
Mm.
It was really, really difficult for me. I love animals. I have a ton of pets. I have two cats, a chinchilla, and a puppy right now. So it was a little challenging. But, I was taking a bunch of classes kind of on the side in like tropical biology, botany, those kinds of fields. And I started to explore those categories more. One of my advisors at the time, Lynn Wesley, she was so great. She actually hooked me up with an internship at the Chicago Botanic Garden. So I was doing that actually in tandem with my time at Rosalind Franklin. And so that was in the
Cool.
lab of Dr. Krista Skogan. She's super awesome, does great work. At the time, I was studying, Enothera pollen, which doesn't sound too exciting, but if you look at it under a microscope, it's all these really fun shapes, really beautiful when they're stained. But I
Mm.
realized that I really hated going to the medical school to do that work. um, and that I was really looking forward to leaving to go to the Botanic Garden on those
Mm.
days. And that was about, I want to say, like a year and a half before I was supposed to graduate. So I worked with my
Oh my
advisor.
goodness.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, real whirlwind.
Yeah,
um,
totally.
yeah, but I made it work. I worked with my advisor. The nice thing about the pre med track and
Mm.
kind of like the extra science classes you can take as like, additions to your major. I actually had a lot of the credits that I needed, and I already had the biology on track there. I actually ended up graduating early in 2015 and just
Wow.
kept kind of working as an intern with Chris Skogan. Eventually, the time kind of came around where I was like, what's next? And, kind of shyly went up to her asking if she'd be interested in a master's student. And the rest was kind of history from there. I studied with her for a while. I did the master's program. It was really great. I got to work with her in the lab, in the greenhouses there, and in the field out in Colorado, which was super fun. We were in like the Pueblo Villa Canyon area, which is
Oh,
like a high desert prairie type area.
gorgeous.
Yeah, it was absolutely beautiful. But yeah, so I did work out there. Eventually, I started focusing on my own research for my graduate
Mm.
program thesis. So I was looking at Enothera harringtonii, which is endemic to that region of
Could
Colorado. And I
could
basically collected a bunch of seeds from different like maternal line genetics and brought them back to the Chicago Botanic Garden where I grew them in a greenhouse setting. And I was super interested in kind of like so there's a lot of studies on precipitation events and the amount of
Mhm.
water that plants receive, but I was really focused on it in terms of like a climate change ecology lens of like
Oh,
the
cool.
precipitation frequency. Yeah,
Yes.
so not just how much water but like the interval between watering
Uh-huh.
events. So yeah,
When, like, the
I
frequency. Oh, so
yeah.
cool.
But yeah, so I looked at that in the greenhouse basically from like germination all the way through flower. And it was really fun. I had to hand water all the plants because we had different watering treatments and it was like 400. And I had to move
Oh
them
my god.
around to make sure that they were randomized every single day. So there was like no placement effects basically in the
Yeah,
greenhouse. But yeah, I was studying like their growth and development, any differences that could be attributed to maternal line genetics, basically plant size and phenology, so
everything.
like when the flowers bloomed, yeah,
Yeah.
and then also their morphology and the flower count. But yeah, I kind of catered it around at one point or another. I realized that I was really interested in the cannabis space. And
Mm.
so my research, I tried to kind of gear it as much as I could towards the cannabis plant, the greenhouse setting, and some work that would hopefully get me in the door
And
into the cannabis industry.
that is so cool. Like, it's that's such a cool story. There's so much to unpack there. I love that it was something that was your interest and like a passion since you were a kid, and that you've always been a nature lover and have always been outside and have always loved plants and animals. And it's kind of cool that you went into a pre-med base and started there. I think that is kind of something that happens at university. I
Yeah.
think you kind of get told to be like, oh, you like biology, go pre-med. But I could imagine that being really challenging if you're a nature lover and have so many pets as you already do. I think you mentioned four. That,
Yeah.
yeah, the animal testing would be really difficult, but I'm happy that you found that passion again and you had that kind of realization to be like, I'm dreading to go to one place, but I'm loving going to my other internship. And like, there's something about this botanical garden that this is really like pulling at my interest. One question for just a follow up. When you mentioned your thesis and the kind of research that you did that focused and kind of streamlined you into the cannabis sector when you were looking at morphology. So, what does the plant look like? When is it flowering? How is it in relation to water? What was the actual species? Because I know you said it in Latin, but that means nothing to me. What is the actual plant that you looked at in Colorado?
Yes, it's called Harrington's primrose. It's
Okay.
absolutely beautiful. It grows in these like rosette fashions, which you can kind of think of as almost like
Oh.
a spiral, sort of, but
Hmm.
like a circular spiral almost, like the leaves alternating around. The flowers only open at night and then they only last for a single day. So they're super important for, plant insect interactions, particularly the species of hawk moth called Hyles
Mm.
lineata. They're like these giant moths, like not what you think of, in your closet, but like almost the size of small birds. And
Yeah.
yeah, they're migratory. They're super important, not just in the ecosystem where I worked, but, all sorts of plants in all different areas. They basically travel across North America and they use this one plant as their main tool for reproductive success. So
Oh, okay.
they lay their eggs on it and feed on the flowers to help give them fuel through the desert for their journey.
Hmm.
So, if there's changes in like the phenology, like when those
Hmm.
flowers open, then you
Open.
have like an asynchronous mismatch, right? So if the flowers aren't there when the hawks get there, that's not only problematic for the moths, but then anything else down the line that the moth needs to
Hmm.
pollinate.
Totally, and it's such like an aggressive and very sensitive environment, high
Yeah.
deserts, right? So like that is such a like a keystone species and a keystone kind of ecology part of it of where it starts. That's really cool. And another follow up on that is when you mentioned that like you already kind of knew that you were going to go into the cannabis sector and you're like this is what I'm interested in, and you said you geared your research to streamline you towards that or to match that. What aspects of your research was similar to the cannabis sector? Like, what were you looking at in particular? Was it the genetic aspect, or was it the morphology aspect, or the pheno- phenology, phenotype? Is that the right word? If you could help me out on that, because I am a geologist at heart, not a biologist.
Yeah, well, geology is awesome. But yeah, so Phenotype is more of like the outward expression of the genotype, right? So basically, like
Mm,
what you can visibly see about the plant that is a reflection of its genetics, right? And the code inside.
okay.
Where phenology is more about like the timing of flowering events, or not, it doesn't just have to be flowering events, it can be like biological events in
Anything.
general. But in
Yep.
my case, yeah, flowering events. So, how I translate it to cannabis, I mean, honestly, I'd never cultivated cannabis, let alone had any sort of like insight into what it was like, but I knew plants generally. And so I figured the best approach would be, what do plants need? How do they
Mhm.
grow? What are these operators most likely doing in a greenhouse? And how can I provide value, right? So working in a greenhouse, one, seemed like a really good start.
Mm.
Learning how to use all the equipment, the automation, the environmental controls, and then also, working with a species that could be a little picky, a little sensitive. The different genetics of the maternal line genetics in cannabis, right? Well, going actually back to the phenotypes, right? So there's this process
Mhm.
of breeding called pheno-hunting. And
Okay.
pheno-hunting is what it sounds like. You're basically selecting plants based off their visible traits in hopes that they, have the characteristics that you're looking for basically down the line where they ultimately flower. And so I looked at a bunch of maternal line genetics, genetic lineages in my work to see if there were any differences there, especially as it pertained to the flower morphology down the line. So, again, same thing with cannabis. All the buds are going to look different depending on their genetic lineage. With the floral morphology and phenology, I did like headspace analysis on the terpenes of those flowers, which sounds really cool, but it really just meant I was up late at night alone in a greenhouse watching flowers open and just waiting until it happened. And then I would like record the time and like
Mhm.
bag the flower to basically like get
Preserve
the
it.
yeah, get the VOCs out of it. And then like, measuring the flower, the size, seeing the sucrose content, and basically what terpenes were present. And terpenes are in all flowers. Cannabis produces like the most terpenes, which is what makes it so special.
Okay.
But so getting experience with that as well. So yeah, just kind of a lot of parallels there, just things that I thought could potentially give me a leg up in the space down the line.
Oh, totally. I feel like you came in completely prepped that you're like, I know everything that about you want to throw any question at me about cannabis or anything about that plant and a picky plant. I got you. I have this completely in the bag. When you said terpenes, what does that actually mean? Could you define that for somebody who maybe doesn't know what that means? Like me, I have no idea what a terpene means.
Yeah, so terpenes are like, I guess, when you smell a flower,
Hmm.
terpenes are basically the compounds that are
Oh.
responsible, like all the different terpenes make up the scent that is that flower smell, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of them are used in manufactured products, right? So, like
Hmm.
shampoos often are high in things like limonene or linalool to give it that, fruity, fragrant scent. They basically dominate our world in terms of, olfactory senses, but they also are used as like therapeutic additives to things. So, if you think of like lavender,
Hmm.
all those different
Spa.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like all those, different smells, those essential oils that you think of are for the most part derived from terpenes. And the
Okay.
cannabis plant produces like
A
hundreds and
million.
hundreds of them in a single plant. Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. Most
Yeah.
plants have like a few, a small handful.
Well, weed does have that like very stereotypical
Yeah.
smell that you're like that's cannabis. If we could kind of dive into a little bit of your work in product development and your background in product development, I was wondering if we could kind of explain or if you could explain your role and responsibility because on the surface, I don't really know what that means. It seems a little bit vague of like what do you do in product development? Are you developing new products? Are you developing new strains of weed, of cannabis? How does that work?
Yeah. So it probably helped to kind of start looking at like my first role. So,
Okay.
yeah, because there's a lot of overlap in the responsibilities and it kind of explains how things kind of came to be. But
Okay.
my first role when I eventually joined Cresco, I was brought on as their director of cultivation, standards and practices. So that's a little for anyone who's familiar or unfamiliar with the cannabis industry. It's a little different than your traditional director of cultivation or DOC role. So
Mm.
most of those positions are, put in a single grow or maybe a small number of grows or facilities. And their whole responsibility is basically overseeing all the plants on a day to day basis, making sure they're successful in terms of yield performance, just giving the plants what they need
Mhm.
and also making sure that kind of like from a facility standpoint that everything's well on an operational standpoint too, right? So production, all of that, labor metrics, but
Mhm.
ultimately caring for the plant. So my role was a little bit different in terms of I wasn't at a specific facility or site, but rather I was based out of our headquarters and kind of
Oh.
worked as like a bridge to all of our sites to our corporate team. And I had a really neat opportunity of being able to go out and travel to our various sites just to
Mhm.
make sure that there was good communication between the sites, our teams. If any problems, arose, I would kind of go out and we called it putting out the fires, so to
Mhm.
speak. Did a lot of like kind of like data and analytics to make sure that we were, hitting our targets, our KPIs, things like that. I handled all of our like what we called our cultivation best practice strategies. So
Mhm.
kind of like the creation or implementation of new practices that improved our growing operations, mostly that we, uncovered through cultivation R&D, which was something I got to lead,
Mhm.
which was super cool. So if we
That's
wanted to
really
try out
cool.
like yeah,
Yeah.
like new fertilizers, substrates, or like methods for taking care of the plants. We would do it at a small scale. If it worked well, we'd roll it out to our facilities. There's tons of fun stuff like documentation, but the
Yeah.
best part of it all was definitely the new genetic development program, which was really fun. So I got to, kind of build that program from the ground out, starting at Cresco, and it was super fun, wild ride for sure.
Mhm.
But that's kind of where I started to get into what I would call the product development space. After about, I want to say like maybe just shy of 2 years in that role, there was a new department forming at Cresco, and it was the product development department. And
Mhm.
so, they were trying to figure out what kind of positions they wanted in that role. And they were hoping to get an SME across, three different areas of
Mhm.
operations, basically. So you have cultivation, which I eventually assumed that role as the senior director of product development. But
Amazing.
then there were, thank you, then there were two other counterparts. So we had, one of my counterparts was in edibles manufacturing, and then the other was in kind
Mhm.
of like concentrates, extracts, vapes. They're just all
Mm.
kind of like the three tiers of your main product lines, right? But in that role, I still maintained a lot of the same functions that I had in the original role.
Mhm.
Now I didn't do that on my own, especially as, that grew over
No, it's a
time.
huge team.
Yeah,
Yes, yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
But so it was a lot of collaboration still, with my partners in the technical cultivation side of things. But yeah, we, largely worked together on the new genetic development. And then there was the whole, kind of line of products of, okay, so we produce the flower, like
Mhm.
now what? So outside of, let's
Where do
say,
you
the
go from
packaged
there?
flower forms, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. You have pre rolls, you have like your shake, you have infused flower products, which would be like a collaboration between me with the, manufacturing side, right? Like how can we combine concentrates and flower to create an
Cool.
infused form that was super potent. um, that's
Yeah.
a big driver in the industry. But other things that I did in that role was, for let's say the existing flower packaged products, really working with like our quality teams to
Mhm.
collaborate on creating the brand standards. We had a brand portfolio, and we had visual standards, quality standards, and just
Oh, totally.
differences that,
Yeah.
yeah, you
You're
would put into
trying to
each of those
control
lines.
trying to control a natural thing and a natural product is something really difficult, but you're trying to control it as best you can in terms of branding and consistency, but then I think that's also really cool that you are also trying to create new products and new SOPs throughout all of your different sites and kind of being the forefront of that and the forefront of the genetic part of it and the genetic program. I think that's really, really cool. Like it's a complicated role. I can't imagine what your day to day looked like. I'm sure it was extremely stressful at times, but also very, very fun, very rewarding. That's fantastic. Congratulations, Kat. Like that is such a cool job and cool responsibility to be part of and to be part of that team.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean the SRPs, that was a really fun task, I will say, because every single site is completely different. Every single
Mm.
state has different rules, different regulations. So you can't just really do like a blanket statement across the board. Like for example, in Ohio, you can't sell like an eighth of flour. They have some
Oh.
weird measurement because they're trying to get away from, what they would consider legacy measurements.
Oh, I see. Yeah, we didn't even touch like the policy and the like criminalization and like the state of weed in state by state or selling. Yes, that is a whole other thing that I'm sure we'll talk
Yeah,
about
that's
a
that's a
little
whole
bit.
nother episode.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. I was wondering, could we kind of go back a little bit to probably your previous role when you were looking at cultivation and when you were looking at actually getting the plants and taking care of the plants and looking at a site from a scientific kind of point of view. When you're looking at like that development and that cultivation, is it really pure botany? Is it like within your greenhouse? It sounds like there's a combination of your genetic component as well. Could you kind of maybe talk about the process of how does that happen? Where you go from like the very beginning of like a new strain or a new type of cannabis and you're going just pure flower, you're not even getting complicated yet of doing like edibles or something else. How does that actually work? Is it fully greenhouse work? Is it full genetic work? How does that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, at least in terms of cannabis, pretty much all of that happens at a facility. So,
Okay.
one rule you should know is you can't bring cannabis in or out of a facility. Otherwise, the state will get very, very upset with you. So, everything has to stay contained in one
Okay.
place. When it came to like new genetic development, there's a few routes you can go. Recently a lot of states have been allowing you to source TC or tissue culture in, but more
Okay.
traditionally, yeah, a lot of people are working through what's called like pheno-hunting methods, or you can do your in-house breeding, but in-house breeding then just turns into a pheno hunt down the line.
Okay.
So starting with kind of like the pheno hunt, it all starts with sourcing good quality genetics. That's
Mm.
probably one of the most important factors going in, quality out. So, you basically are going to have, let's say, source seeds from hopefully well established breeders who know what they're doing. And then a lot of times you're going to get what's kind of like an unstable seed line. So you'll get, we'll call it strain A. And from strain A, you might get a bag of 20 plus seeds. For those seeds for that one strain line, or it's going to be, a strain, but with the genetic lineage, you're going to
Mhm.
want to run a pheno hunt. And when you run pheno hunts, ideally you want as many, many seeds to germinate as possible. And the
Mm.
reason for that is because it's, like I said, a rather unstable line.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is like, you're not, when you germinate those 20 plus 50, 100, you name it, seeds, they're not all going to be the same. You can kind of think of them almost as like siblings, I like to
Yeah.
use, right? Like you have your mom, your dad, you can have 20 siblings, but y'all might have different eye colors, hair colors,
Mhm.
preferences. So part of that pheno hunting process is basically creating all those, little
Different options.
seedlings.
Yeah.
Yes. And then picking out what the winner would be, right? So you have once they germinate, what you're going to do is wait until they grow their first true leaves. And then an important step is basically checking the gender. So I would do my own PCR gender assays, which is really fun. It was pretty simple. It was just like a binary color code reaction. And the goal is to basically either first determine the males,
Mhm.
and then once you determine the males, either remove them and kill them off, or put them somewhere where they can't bother anything for future breeding efforts. The reason being, so every plant that you see in a production facility is going to be
Yeah.
female. Yeah, no males in the space. They just kind of ruin everything. Because just in a cannabis sense, because if any pollen gets out, then they're basically going to pollinate all your females. Cannabis is traditionally a wind pollinated plant.
Okay.
So yeah, if you have pollen in the space, it's going to basically, reproduce with all your females, and then all your females are going to seed out, which is great if you're
Oh,
trying to get new genetics. It's not great if you're trying to sell that flower.
yeah. If you're trying to keep it as like that's the actual product and the actual thing. So you
Yeah.
want when you're getting a flower, it's ungerminated, like it's non-pollinated. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, like,
Okay.
part of the whole flowering phase, which is going to be around, I mean, it depends. Usually in production, you're looking at around like 60 to 65 days because you're
Mm.
running a continuous harvest model. Some strains might take more time to mature, less time. That's one of the things you're looking for if you're trying to grow genetics at scale. But if you're a craft grow, it's super nice to have that flexibility to grow strains longer than you might be able to otherwise. But yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, you're basically sexually frustrating the female plants. You're encouraging them to grow
To stay.
bigger,
Yeah.
larger flowers to
Yeah.
hopefully take up more surface area and catch some wayward pollen. So that's part of the goal in terms of at least increasing your yields in the flowering phase.
That's crazy. That's very, very different. Yeah. I didn't realize actually on first glance that it was like non-pollinated and like completely that's what you were doing and that's what you're pushing when you're pushing towards flower. And that's crazy that that's one of the first things of taking all the males out
Yep.
of the entire system of the breeding system. When you're developing the kind of these new strains and when you're looking at these new plants, I know that you mentioned potency and that's something that's really common within the industry. What are you looking for? Like what other constraints are you going through? I forget that name of that fancy word that I just learned, but the one that smells. Are you looking for smell? Are you looking for consistency and branding of like color? Are you looking for potency? You're probably looking for a little bit of everything. How does that work?
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, at the point that you've gotten rid of all the males, right?
Mm.
Now you just have a bunch of ladies in the room and you're trying to basically now evaluate their production success, right?
Okay.
Their growth and development. So, you're making sure that they're growing with great vigor, they're growing strong, they're growing fast, and you're going to start by looking at kind of like their growth patterns, right? To make sure
Mm.
that it's they're not growing too lanky or too squat. So the clone phase, germination and clone is going to be around 14 plus days. The germination
Okay.
will take a little longer, but your clone phase is around that 14 day or 2 week window. Then in the veg phase, they're going to be in there for, 21 days, maybe up to 5 weeks, depending on kind of what you're going for there. But once, the plant really begins to start flowering, then you're going to start looking at things like what is the bud structure like, right? So it can look
Mm.
all different ways. It could look like almost like little ropes or fingers or foxtails, which is not ideal. It could be really, really dense, which can be absolutely great, but it can also be problematic down the line in terms of, let's say, pathogens or yeast and mold counts,
Mm.
microbial counts. Everything in cannabis is tested by ISO certified third party labs
Yeah.
governed by the state, not
Yeah.
us. So, we're basically held to almost like pharmaceutical standards, except we're
Wow.
operating with plants
Yeah,
and
that's
in a substrate.
natural. Oh
Yep.
my goodness.
Yeah, and of course, there's a whole bunch of rules on what you can do to prevent things like pest pressure, right?
Mhm.
Or pathogens. In a lot of states, you're limited to like the 25B list approved by the EPA, which is, your very basic items like neem oil, like rosemary oil. You can't really use like traditional pesticides on the plants. And then even those ultimately are restricted once you're in flower. So you
Oh,
really have to
wow.
get
Okay.
everything right up until that time.
Oh my
Um,
goodness. It's like
yeah,
a
so
clean lab, but it's a clean lab with plants, which is insane. That's almost
all the
impossible.
facilities look like labs when you walk
Yeah.
down like the hallways. They're very sterile. But yeah, so when they're in the flower, right, you're looking for disease resistance. That's one
Mm.
thing. Bud structure, color. For some reason, everyone loves purple cannabis. It's really nothing special. It's all aesthetic. Like, it
It's
can
pretty.
be it is pretty. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't get me wrong. I mean, you can have black cannabis, all sorts of
Mm.
colors. It's just more exciting, I guess, than the traditional green weed people see. But they're also looking for, trichome density. So the trichomes are going to hold the cannabinoids, that
Okay.
potency that we talked about.
Yeah.
And then you're also going to want something, when you walk into a room that's late in flower, you should be able to smell it. So each plant is going to have its own unique, terpene, flavonoid profile. So, when the consumer eventually gets it, that's going to be what it smells like, what it tastes like. But yeah, looking for all sorts of things, mostly in terms of appeal. So that's where you have like that trichome density,
Yeah. The
the
look
bud
of it.
structure, the
Yep.
color,
Mhm.
yeah, and just the general, I guess, bag appeal at the end of the day. Because there's so many strains out there that people want diversity in terms of
Mhm.
their menu. So you
Yeah.
have to keep making
New
new,
things.
novel strains. Can't just do
Yeah.
the same thing over and over again. But yeah, once you're in flower and you're ready to harvest your plant, that's when you're going to basically dry it down, trim it up, and send it out for potency testing. So we always like to do, kind of like an R&D round of potency testing for
Mm.
new genetics. The goal is to see if it hits that mark, right?
Mhm.
Because it can be the most beautiful flower, it can smell great, it can be perfect in every other way, but if it tests under a certain percent, you're never going
It's
to be
not
able to
worth it.
sell it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
It's super unfortunate though because I'm personally someone who prefers lower potency
Me
flower.
too.
Yeah, I just feel like a lot of markets, it's like getting the bang for your buck and
Mhm.
they're just, really focused on how strong of a product they can get. But then, you really kind of get put into this bottleneck of everything just kind of being the same, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I always cut my edibles into like a quarter and then I'm like, okay, I will take like a quarter of two. Like I'm just very sensitive to it. So I also really like a low potency product. I wanted to kind of maybe jump a little bit and talk about misconceptions, because I think you brought up something of like how difficult cannabis is, of like how fast it's moving, how it's a rapid new sector, how it changes state by state, how you're highly regulated. But I also want to talk a little bit about misinformation, because I think that's another big thing about the cannabis sector. And I even know it's very different sitting up here in Canada and Vancouver, where it's now legalized, versus down in the States. Could you kind of speak a little bit about misinformation regarding cannabis and maybe debunk some of the main ones that you face in terms of your job and your role?
I would say, one of the biggest ones, at least that I've encountered when I first started out in the cannabis industry is I don't I always knew it was a professional operation. I'm not
Hmm.
sure what other people thought. Like, I'm pretty sure many people thought I was gonna go work in some sketchy basement in the middle of nowhere, like growing cannabis, Breaking Bad style.
Yeah.
That is not what these operations for the most part look
No.
like. So like we were saying earlier, they're like these I mean, in my experience, largely very sterile operations. We're talking white walls that are super easy to clean,
Hmm.
epoxy flooring, very professional. It looks like, I've worked in lab settings. It looks like a
Hmm.
lab for the most part. You have individual rooms where you're growing your cannabis. It's all very clean, very sterile, very organized. Each plant is going to have its own unique identifying barcode to where when,
It's
let's
high
say, the
tech.
state comes in on
Hmm.
their weekly audit, they can basically say what the unique identifier is. And then you have to be like, oh, yeah, it's in room number 4 in the flower stage. It's 27 days in and it's on, section 2 of table 4. And you have to be able to tell them exactly where that one plant is. It's very organized, it's very
Hmm.
clean. There's definitely been a lot of communication in terms of, this isn't just some sketchy basement
Hmm.
grow situation. I think people are starting to understand that it's a professional industry. And so that's really, refreshing. But outside of that, I feel like a lot of stigmas and
Yeah.
misconceptions around cannabis. A lot of it, I think, is just like lack of information, either around the process or people who consume it. Like one thing that drives me crazy is the whole kind of like attitude or stereotype of like people use cannabis or like
Hmm.
stoners or lazy or unmotivated. Most of the people, so many of my peers consume
Hmm.
cannabis. Most of the people I've worked with smoke cannabis.
Yeah.
And it's like a group of amazing, driven, talented, motivated people because, we don't have, unlike other industries, right? It's not like you go in and everything's just laid out for you and you
No.
already have everything set up. You're basically building processes as you go. You're
Yeah.
tackling new problems on a regular basis, and everything is always changing. And, unless you were in, let's say, like the legacy market prior,
Hmm.
it's a very new industry for most people in the
Hmm.
space. So, like, I remember sitting down for a project, and, to the left of me, I had like an automation engineer who previously worked in the coffee industry on automation
Cool.
equipment. And
Oh,
then to my
fantastic.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like I have a previously, professionally trained French patisserie chef, right? And we're trying to figure out automation equipment for edibles production. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, in what industry do you have such like a wide range of just experts from different fields who all came in to basically try their hand at this
Hmm.
challenge that is a new and emerging industry. So I don't know, the whole idea of like stoner stereotypes drives me crazy. I'm
Yeah.
like my first COO that I worked under started like his first company before he was 30 and it
Hmm.
was successful and then he got into cannabis. Like the people in the industry are amazing and some of the
Hmm.
most driven people that I know. Another one that really drives me crazy is probably the federal scheduling of cannabis right now in the US. So, right now, and let me be clear, like they have had talks about reclassifying it.
Mm.
And I don't know, I guess you guys don't have the same process because the FDA is in
Yeah.
the US, but we have like a scheduling process for drugs, with Schedule 1 being the
Hmm.
worst of the worst, right? And cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug. So it's up there with literally the worst
That's
drugs that you could have.
that's shocking. I didn't know that. I didn't know it was a Schedule 1 drug. That's
Oh yeah.
absolutely crazy, because it's
Yeah.
not that potent as like that's
No.
wild. It's used
Yeah.
like also like medicinally, and it can be used to help and to cure a lot of ailments and pain. Like that's crazy.
Well, so that's what drives me crazy because so it's a Schedule 1 drug as classified by, the FDA. And what that means is that there are no approved, recognized medicinal benefits, qualities, or uses of the drug, and that it has a high potential for abuse. The funny thing is, the FDA has also approved 3 drugs that use cannabis in them while it's still classified. So,
Mhm.
I mean, there's like, I don't actually know how to say it, but I think it's Epidiolex. I am probably pronouncing that wrong, but it is a medication that is derived directly from cannabis, and it's basically used for like children who don't respond well to traditional medications
Mhm.
for seizures and epilepsy at,
Oh, yeah.
2 years of age and above that. There's 2 other drugs. I think one is like, I think it's Marinol or Mirano, and
Okay.
then another one's like Syndros, and those are used for nausea and anti-vomiting treatment
Mhm.
in chemotherapy patients or cancer patients receiving chemotherapy.
Mhm.
But yeah, so we have 3 FDA approved drugs, but the FDA also says there's no medicinal value. And to give you an idea of like the context of where that sits, like, oxycodone is like a Schedule 2 drug.
Mhm.
So cannabis is considered worse than that, even when you put the whole, opioid epidemic in
Yeah.
perspective. So yeah, that's another thing that kind of grinds my gears.
Oh my goodness, of course it would. I mean, it grinds my gears of just being like a user or a consumer of cannabis, let alone within the industry. Like that's honestly very, very sad because like
Yeah.
I think like one of the big misconceptions of like, yes, stoners and everything, I think it devalues who actually can benefit from cannabis. And one person in my life is my mom. She has like terrible arthritis and she is a regular user of cannabis because it helps her with her pain and it helps her sleep and it helps her just function with bone pain and muscle pain, and it's been a huge game changer in terms of her sleep regulation, in terms of her pain management. It's been fantastic, and it hasn't had really any negative effects. And also she's a nurse, like she knows that it works better than other products or other medicine for her and for her health. So
Yeah. I'm sorry to sorry to hear about your mom, but I'm glad she's able to find relief for it.
yeah, no, it's okay. I think it's just like it's part of aging, but I think it does
Yeah.
tell you a lot of like when medical professionals and nurses are like, yeah, this is the good stuff. This helps. Like this is what's changed my life and helped me with my pain. Do you know maybe where you're going to go in terms of an industry, or is there any talk of what regulations are going to look like in the future or change to regulation?
I mean, I'm honestly really curious. It's one of the things that I'm
Mm,
looking forward to seeing, right? Because right now, I think we have 24 states where it is legalized. I think there's an additional 14 states where it's medical, and then maybe 7 where it's decriminalized. So I'm really excited to see how this all plays out. In the US, we've been talking a lot about
mhm.
federal legalization. We're a little slow to it, especially when you think of like the state counts, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you just add like the medical and recreational alone, it's like you already
Mhm.
have more than half the
Everybody.
states on board.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Mm,
But yeah, I'm really curious to see how it all plays out. There's outside of it just, being available for everyone and
mhm,
everywhere. I'm really curious to see, what it looks like in terms of, let's say, distribution and production, because
mhm,
right now you can't bring cannabis over state lines. So when we're going into a new market, this is another thing that makes our industry unique is like if you're Campbell's soup, you're producing a
mhm,
few factories, right? And then you're distributing your product all across the country out of those few facilities.
mhm.
Whenever we enter a new market in the cannabis industry, you have to build all your
Oh my
operations
goodness, that's
to
so
supply that
expensive.
state. Yeah, so you have a production facility, at least one, in every state that you operate in, maybe retail there. You can only sell what you're growing in that state. But so you have all these states with, basically in the legal cannabis market with so many production facilities.
Mhm,
Like, one company might have 1 or 5 in a state, and then you think about all the other companies operating in that state. So,
mhm.
like, when it becomes federally legal, are there still going to be regulations about crossing state lines? If
Yeah.
not, how does that change, kind of like the landscape in terms of what happens to all these facilities? Like,
Mhm.
are we all just going to grow out west?
Yeah, how is that
You
gonna
know,
work? Yeah.
exactly. And then how does that kind of change, like just the structure of the industry, right? A lot of things like that. Also curious about what, standardization would look like in terms of quality controls. Like
Mhm,
we talked a little bit about, cannabis testing by third party
mhm.
labs. It is different in every state. There are, some states that only test for things that they know are pathogenic. And
Mm,
then there are other states that are like, no, we're going to take a very cautious approach and test for
everything.
literally all viable bacteria. So
Wow.
yeah, it's crazy. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out. And then also just kind of what it opens the door for.
Mhm,
There's already talks also in the US on other scheduled drugs, basically,
mhm.
working their way through the same process. Like a big one is psilocybin, right?
Yeah,
There's a big push for that, especially to help with, PTSD,
yeah,
people suffering from
dementia.
trauma. Yeah,
Mhm,
all sorts of things. And so I'm really curious to see how cannabis plays out and then how that I think will likely create a domino effect of
mhm.
other previously scheduled drugs getting recognized.
Mhm. And moving on up through the system. And like, that's crazy. If we could talk a little bit, because I know we're at time. So I want to be cognizant of that. So I just want to ask one more. And that is what has been maybe the most rewarding or the most surprising aspect of working within the cannabis sector? What's something that when you transitioned from pure research and academia and pure botany, I know you're still within botany, but when you transition from that to cannabis, what's something that's been like very fulfilling or that stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I'd say really just it's really exciting. It's
Hmm.
a new industry. You're constantly doing things outside of your job description in order to help build the plane while you're flying it. It's a really novel experience because the rules are changing as you go. There really is not much of a format depending especially
Hmm.
on when you got in the industry. So you really have a chance to, build a niche for yourself,
Cool.
which is really exciting moving into the space. I think it's really appealing. I think it's why people come to
Highly
the industry.
motivated. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of drive in it. You get to meet a lot of really amazing people, and I feel like you see all these, it's like, "Oh, are you ready to work for a fast-paced industry or fast-paced company?" It's like if you see someone who's worked in cannabis, like they're
Yeah.
good. Like I promise. It's a really unique environment with, a really diverse group of talents and people
Mhm.
all kind of working towards the same goal. It's exciting, a little addictive. Honestly, if I had to do the same thing every single day, I would be bored. So it's kind of ruined me in that regard.
Yeah.
But honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Oh, that's so amazing. That's a perfect place to end it. And like, you can tell you love it. Like this entire time, like you can tell one that you're an expert, like hands down, you know this like the back of your hand. But like two, that you love this industry. You can just tell how happy you are that your job makes you, and that like it's so fulfilling in terms of intellectual stimulation, but also like economics and business. And it has like a beautiful merge of what you've been passionate about since you were a kid with plants and natural systems, but now with like meeting people and being kind of invigorated at work. So very beautiful. It was so cool to learn. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming in and talking about cannabis and explaining things to a complete novice and to somebody that really didn't know half the words, and explaining it with a lot of patience and grace. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Awesome. For those listening, this has been the Smoko podcast. Thank you very much for listening. We will see you next week with a new episode. Bye bye.